Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 5 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 1, Chapter 3, The Jews and the Conversos, Part 5. The Sentencia Estatuto threatened to introduce a new principle into public and canon law, both of which had always upheld the brotherhood of Christians and had encouraged conversions by prescribing the utmost favor for converts. Nicholas V was appealed to and responded September 24, 1449, with a bull declaring that all the faithful are one, that the laws of Alfonso X and his successors, admitting converts to all the privileges of Christians, were to be enforced, and he commissioned the archbishops of Toledo and Seville, the bishops of Valencia, Avila, and Cordova, and the abbot of San Fagun to excommunicate all who sought to invalidate them. More than this seems to have been needed, and in 1450 he formally excommunicated Pedro Sarmiento and his accomplices as the authors of the Sentencia Estatuto, and again in 1451 he repeated his bull of 1449. Finally, in the same year, the synods of Vitoria and Alcalá condemned it, and Alfonso de Montalvo, the foremost jurist of the time, pronounced it to be illegal. It never, in fact, was of binding force, but the effort made to set it aside shows how dangerous a menace it was and how it expressed a widespread public opinion. It was the first fitful gust of the tornado. Toledo remained the hotbed of disturbance. In 1461 the martial archbishop Alonso Carrillo commissioned the learned Alonso de Oropesa, general of the Geronimites, to investigate the cause of dissension. He did so and reported that there were faults on both sides, and at the request of the archbishop he proceeded to write his Lumen ad Revelationem Gentium to prove the unity of the faithful. But while he was engaged in this pious labor, the inextinguishable feud broke out afresh. Any chance disturbance might bring this about, and the opportunity was furnished in 1467 when the canons, who enjoyed a revenue based on the bread of the town of Maqueda, farmed it out to a Jew. Alvaro Gomez, an alcalde mayor, was lord of Maqueda. His alcalde beat the Jew and seized the bread for the use of the castle. The canons promptly imprisoned the alcalde and summoned Gomez to answer. When he came, the quarrel grew bitterer. The Count of Cifuentes, leader of one of the factions of the city and protector of the Conversos, espoused the cause of Gomez, while Fernando de la Torre, a leader of the Conversos, hoping to revenge the defeat of 1449, boasted that he had at command 4,000 well-armed fighting men, being 6 times more than the Old Christians could muster. Matters were ripe for an explosion, and on July 21st, at a conference held in the cathedral, the followers of the two parties taunted each other beyond endurance. Swords were drawn and blood polluted the sanctuary, though only one man was slain. The canons proceeded to fortify and garrison the cathedral, which was attacked the next day. The clergy, galled by the fire of the assailants, to create a diversion, started a conflagration in the Calle de la Chapineria, which spread until 8 streets were destroyed, the richest in Toledo, crowded with shops full of costly merchandise. The device was successful. The Conversos were disheartened and lost ground, till on the 29th Cifuentes and Gomez fled, while Fernando de la Torre and his brother Alvaro were captured and hanged. The triumphant faction removed from office all their opponents and revived with additional rigor the Sentencia Estatuto. Toledo at the time belonged to the party of the pretender Alfonso XII, but When the citizens sent to him to confirm what they had done, he refused, and the city soon afterwards transferred its allegiance to Henry IV. It is quite probable that, in reward for this, he confirmed the sentencia estatuto, for when, about the same time, Ciudad Real revolted from Alfonso and adhered to Henry, he granted, July 14, 1468, to that city that henceforth no Converso should hold municipal office. In the all-pervading lawlessness, such disturbances as those of Toledo met with neither repression nor punishment. In 1470 Valladolid saw a similar tumult, in which the Old Christians and Conversos flew to arms and struggled for mastery. The former sent for Ferdinand and Isabella, who came, but the majority of the citizens preferred Henry IV, and the royal pair were glad to escape. Everywhere the hatred between the Old Christians and the New was manifesting itself in this deplorable fashion. In Cordova we are told that the Conversos were very rich, and had bought not only the offices but the protection of Alonso de Aguilar, whose power and high reputation commanded universal respect, while the Old Christians ranged themselves under the Counts of Cabra and the Bishop Pedro de Cordova y Solier. Only a spark was needed to produce an explosion, and an accident during a procession, March 14, 1473, furnished the occasion. With shouts of Viva la fe de Dios, the mob arose, and pillage, murder and fire were let loose upon the city. Alonso and his brother Gonsalvo, the future great captain, quelled the riot at the cost of no little bloodshed, but it burst forth again a few days later, and after a combat lasting 48 hours the Aguilars were forced to take refuge in the Alcázar, carrying with them such Conversos and Jews as they could. Then followed a general sack, in which every kind of outrage and cruelty was perpetrated, until the fury of the mob was exhausted by the lack of victims. Finally Alonso came to terms with the city authorities, who banished the Conversos for ever, and such poor wretches as had escaped torch and dagger were thrust forth to be robbed and murdered with impunity on the highways. Laborers from the country, who chanced to be in Cordova, carried the welcome news to neighboring places, and the flame passed swiftly through Andalusia from town to town. Baena was kept quiet by the Count of Cabra, Palma by Luis Portocarrero, Écija by Fadrique Manrique, and Seville and Jerez by Juan de Guzman and Rodrigo Ponce de Leon. But elsewhere the havoc was terrible. At Jaén the Constable of Castile, Miguel Luis de Iranzo, was treacherously murdered while kneeling before the altar. His wife, Teresa de Torres, was barely able to escape with her children to the Alcázar, and the Conversos were plundered and dispatched. Only at Almodovar del Campo do we hear of any justice executed on the assassins, for there Rodrigo Giron, master of Calatrava, hanged some of the most culpable. The king, we are told, when the news was brought to him, grieved much but inflicted no punishment. On the accession of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1474, a Converso of Cordova, Anton de Montoro, addressed to them a poem in which he gives a terrible picture of the murders committed with impunity on his brethren, whose purity of faith he asserts. Fire and sword had just ravished the aljama of Carmona, and fresh disasters were threatening at Seville and Cordova. Dominicans and Franciscans were thundering from the pulpits and were calling on the faithful to purify the land from the pollution of Judaism, secret and open. It was commonly asserted and believed that the Christianity of the Conversos was fictitious, and fanaticism joined with envy and greed in stimulating the massacres that had become so frequent. The means adopted to win over the Jewish converts had not been so gentle as to encourage confidence in the sincerity of their professions, and, rightly or wrongly, they were almost universally suspected. The energy with which the new sovereigns enforced respect for the laws speedily put an end to the hideous excesses of the mob, for we hear of no further massacres, but the abhorrence entertained for the successful renegades whose wealth and power were regarded as obtained by false profession of belief in Christ, was still widespread, though its more violent manifestations were restrained. Wise forbearance, combined with vigorous maintenance of order, would in time have brought about reconciliation, to the infinite benefit of Spain, but at a time when heresy was regarded as the greatest of crimes and unity of faith as the supreme object of statesmanship, wise forbearance and toleration were impossible. After suppressing turbulence, the sovereigns therefore felt that there was still a duty before them to vindicate the faith. Thus, after long hesitation, their policy with regard to the Conversos was embodied in the Inquisition introduced towards the end of 1480. The Jewish question required different treatment, and it was solved once for all in a most decisive fashion. The Inquisition had no jurisdiction over the Jew, unless he rendered himself amenable to it by some offense against the faith. He was not baptized, he was not a member of the Church, and therefore was incapable of heresy, which was the object of inquisitorial functions. He might, however, render himself subject to it by proselytism, by seducing Christians to embrace his errors, and this was constantly alleged against Jews, although their history shows that, unlike the other great religions, Judaism has ever been a national faith with no desire to spread beyond the boundaries of the race. As the chosen people, Israel has never sought to share its God with the Gentiles. There was more foundation, probably, in the accusation that the secret perversity of the Conversos was encouraged by those who had remained steadfast in the faith, that circumcisions were secretly performed, and that contributions to the synagogues were welcomed. While the object of the Inquisition was to secure the unity of faith, its founding destroyed the hope that ultimately the Jews would be all gathered into the fold of Christ. This had been the justification of the inhuman laws designed to render existence outside of the Church so intolerable that baptism would be sought as a relief from endless injustice. But the awful spectacle of the autos de fe and the miseries attendant on wholesale confiscations led the Jew to cherish more resolutely than ever the ancestral faith which served him as shield from the terrors of the Holy Office and the dreadful fate ever impending over the Conversos. His conversion could no longer be hoped for, and so long as he remained in Spain, the faithful would be scandalized by his presence, and the converts would be exposed to the contamination of his society. The only alternative was his removal. Isabella tried a partial experiment of this kind in 1480, apparently to supplement the Inquisition, founded about the same time. Andalusia was the province where the Jews were most numerous, and she commenced by ordering the expulsion from there of all who would not accept Christianity, and threatening with death any new settlers. We have no details as to this measure, and only know that it was several times postponed, and that it was apparently abandoned. A bull of Sixtus IV in 1484 shows us that Jews were still dwelling there undisturbed, and when the final expulsion took place in 1492, Bernaldez informs us that from Andalusia 8,000 households embarked at Cadiz, besides many at Cartagena and the ports of Aragon. That there was vacillation is highly probable, for policy and fanaticism were irreconcilable. The war with Granada was calling for large expenditures to which the Jews were most useful contributors, and the finances were in the hands of two leading Jews, Abraham Senior and Isaac of Bravanel, to whose skillful management its ultimate success was largely due. It may be that the threatened expulsion was rather a financial than a religious measure, adopted with a view of selling suspensions and exemptions, and this may also perhaps explain a similar course adopted by Ferdinand when, in May 1486, he ordered the Inquisitors of Aragon to banish all Jews of Saragossa from the Archbishopric of Saragossa and the bishopric of Albarracin, in the same way as they had been banished from the sees of Seville, Cordova and Jaen. The sovereigns knew when to be tolerant and when to give full rein to fanaticism, as was evinced in their treatment of renegades and conversos at the capture of Malaga, as contrasted with the liberal terms offered in the capitulations of Almeria and Granada. They were prepared to listen to the counsel of those who opposed all interference with the Jewish population, in whose favor there were powerful influences at work. Isabella apparently hesitated long between statesmanship and her conceptions of duty, while Torquemada never ceased to urge upon her the service to be rendered to Christ by clearing her dominions of the descendants of his crucifiers. There was no lack of effort to inflame public opinion and to excite still further the hostilities so long and so carefully cultivated. A story had wide circulation that Maestre Ribas Altas, the royal physician, wore a golden ball attached to a cord around his neck, that Prince Juan, only son of the sovereigns, begged it of him and managed to open it when he found inside a parchment on which was painted a crucifix with the physician in an indecent attitude, that he was so affected that he fell sick and after much persuasion revealed the cause, adding that he would not recover until the Jew was burnt, which was accordingly done, and Ferdinand consented to the expulsion of the accursed sect. Then we are told that on Good Friday 1488 some Jews, to avenge an insult, stoned a rude cross which stood on the hill of Gano near Casal de Palomero. They were observed and denounced when the Duke of Alba burnt the rabbi and several of the culprits. The cross was repaired and carried in solemn procession to the parish church, where it still remains an object of popular veneration. It is to this period also that we may presumably refer the fabrication of a correspondence discovered 50 years later among the archives of Toledo by Archbishop Siliceo, between Chamorro, Prince of the Jews of Spain, and Ulif, Prince of those of Constantinople, in which the latter, replying to a request for counsel, tells the former, "As the king takes your property, make your sons apothecaries that they may take Christian lives. As he destroys your synagogues, make your sons ecclesiastics that they may destroy the churches. As he vexes you in other ways, make your sons officials that they may reduce the Christians to subjection and take revenge." The most effective device, however, was a cruel one, carried out by Torquemada unshrinkingly to the end. In June 1490, a converso named Benito Garcia, on his return from a pilgrimage to Compostela, was arrested at Astorga on the charge of having a consecrated wafer in his knapsack. The episcopal vicar, Dr. Pedro de Villada, tortured him repeatedly till he obtained a confession implicating 5 other conversos and 6 Jews in a plot to effect a conjuration with a human heart and a consecrated host, whereby to cause the madness and death of all Christians, the destruction of Christianity, and the triumph of Judaism. 3 of the implicated Jews were dead, but the rest of those named were promptly arrested, and the trial was carried on by the Inquisition. After another year spent in torturing the accused, there emerged the story of the crucifixion at La Guardia of a Christian child whose heart was cut out for the purpose of the conjuration. The whole tissue was so evidently the creation of the torture chamber that it was impossible to reconcile the discrepancies in the confessions of the accused, although the very unusual recourse of confronting them was tried several times. No child had anywhere been missed, and no remains were found on the spot where it was said to have been buried. The inquisitors finally abandoned the attempt to frame a consistent narrative, and on November 16, 1491, the accused were executed at Avila. The 3 deceased Jews were burned in effigy, the 2 living ones were torn with red-hot pincers, and the conversos were "reconciled" and strangled before burning. The underlying purpose was revealed in the sentence read at the auto de fe, which was framed so as to bring into especial prominence the proselytizing efforts of the Jews and the Judaizing propensities of the conversos, and no effort was spared to produce the widest impression on the people. We happen to know that the sentence was sent to La Guardia to be read from the pulpit, and that it was translated into Catalan and similarly published in Barcelona, showing that it was thus brought before the whole population, a thing without parallel in the history of the Inquisition. The cult of the Saint Child of La Guardia, El Santo Niño de la Guardia, was promptly started with miracles and has been kept up to the present day, although the sanctity of the supposed martyr has never been confirmed by the Holy See. Torquemada's object was gained, for, though it would be too much to say that this alone won Ferdinand's consent to the expulsion, it undoubtedly contributed largely to that result. The edict of expulsion, it is true, makes no direct reference to the case, but in its labored efforts to magnify the dangers of Jewish proselytism, it reflects distinctly the admissions extorted from the accused by the Inquisition. With the surrender of Granada in January 1492, the work of the Reconquest was accomplished. The Jews had zealously contributed to it and had done their work too well. With the accession of a rich territory and an industrious Moorish population and the cessation of the drain of the war, even Ferdinand might persuade himself that the Jews were no longer financially indispensable. The popular fanaticism required constant repression to keep the peace. The operations of the Inquisition destroyed the hope that gradual conversion would bring about the desired unity of faith, and the only alternative was the removal of those who could not, without a miraculous change of heart, be expected to encounter the terrible risks attendant upon baptism. It is easy thus to understand the motives leading to the measure without attributing it, as has been done, to greed for the victim's wealth, for though, as we shall see, there are abundant evidences of a desire to profit by it, as a whole it was palpably undesirable financially. Thus the expulsion of the Jews from all the Spanish dominions came to be resolved upon. When this was bruited about the court, Abraham Senior and Abravanel offered a large sum from the aljamas to avert the blow. Ferdinand was inclined to accept it, but Isabella was firm. The story is current that, when the offer was under consideration, Torquemada forced his way into the royal presence and, holding aloft a crucifix, boldly addressed the sovereigns: "Behold the crucified whom the wicked Judas sold for 30 pieces of silver. If you approve that deed, sell him for a greater sum. I resign my power. Nothing shall be imputed to me, but you will answer to God." Whether this be true or not, the offer was rejected, and on March 30th the edict of expulsion was signed, though apparently there was delay in its promulgation, for it was not published in Barcelona until May 1st. It gave the entire Jewish population of Spain until July 31st in which to change their religion or to leave the country, under penalty of death, which was likewise threatened for any attempt to return. During the interval they were taken under the royal protection. They were permitted to sell their effects and carry the proceeds with them, except that, under a general law, the export of gold and silver was prohibited. A supplementary edict of May 14th granted permission to sell lands, leaving but little time in which to effect such transactions, and this was still more fatally limited in Aragon, where Ferdinand sequestered all Jewish property in order to afford claimants and creditors the opportunity to prove their rights, the courts being ordered to decide all such cases promptly. Still less excusable was his detaining from all sales an amount equal to all the charges and taxes which the Jews would have paid him, thus realizing a full year's revenue from the trifling sums obtained through forced sales by the unhappy exiles. In Castile the inextricable confusion arising from the extensive commercial transactions of the Jews led to the issue, May 30th, of a decree addressed to all the officials of the land, ordering all interested parties to be summoned to appear within 20 days to prove their claims, which the courts must settle by the middle of July. All debts falling due prior to the date of departure were to be promptly paid. If due to Christians by Jews who had not personal effects sufficient to satisfy them, the creditors were to take land at an appraised valuation, or be paid out of other debts paid by Jews. For debts falling due subsequently, if due by Jews, the debtors had to pay at once or furnish adequate security. If due by Christians or Moors, the creditors were either to leave powers to collect at maturity, or to sell the claims to such purchasers as they could find. These regulations afford us a glimpse into the complexities arising from the convulsion thus suddenly precipitated, and as the Jews were almost universally creditors, we can readily imagine how great were their losses, and how many Christian debtors must have escaped payment. The sovereigns also shared in the spoils. When the exiles reached the seaports to embark, they found that an export duty of 2 ducats per head had been levied upon them, which they were obliged to pay out of their impoverished store. Moreover, the threat of confiscation for those who overstayed the time was rigorously enforced, and in some cases at least the property thus seized was granted to nobles to compensate their losses by the banishment of their Jews. All effects left behind also were seized. In many cases the dangers of the journey, the prohibition to carry coin, and the difficulty of procuring bills of exchange led the exiles to make deposits with trustworthy friends to be remitted to them in their new homes, all of which was seized by the crown. The amount of this was sufficient to require a regular organization of officials deputed to hunt up these deposits and other fragments of property that could be escheated, and we find correspondence on the subject as late as 1498. Efforts were even also made to follow exiles and secure their property on the plea that they had taken with them prohibited articles, and Henry VII of England and Ferdinand of Naples were appealed to for assistance in cases of this description. The terror and distress of the exodus, we are told, were greatly increased by an edict issued by Torquemada as Inquisitor-General in April, forbidding any Christian after August the 9th from holding any communication with Jews, or giving them food or shelter, or aiding them in any way. Such addition to their woes was scarce necessary, for it would be difficult to exaggerate the misery inflicted on a population thus suddenly uprooted from a land in which their race was older than that of their oppressors. Stunned at first by the blow, as soon as they rallied from the shock, they commenced preparations for departure. An aged rabbi, Isaac Aboab, with 30 prominent colleagues, was commissioned to treat with João II of Portugal for refuge in his dominions. He drove a hard bargain, demanding a cruzado a head for permission to enter and reside for 6 months. For those who were near the coasts, arrangements were made for transport by sea, mostly from Cadiz and Barcelona on the south and Laredo on the north. To the northeast Navarre afforded an asylum by order of Jean Albret and his wife Leonora, although the cities were somewhat recalcitrant. As the term approached, 2 days' grace were allowed, bringing it to August 2nd, the 9th of Av, a day memorable in Jewish annals for its repeated misfortunes. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 5.